Before we start, I think I think most of you had an opportunity to get to know our panelists a little bit. Obviously, it's kind of important for us to get to know you a little bit as well. I think Chris probably popped that question earlier. I was sort of half busy helping Alec doing something, and then I saw half of the hands were raised, like 3/4 or whatever. So maybe you can just help me out, because it would help gear towards sort of the the questions. I have a bunch prepared, but I just want to see what the audience is and what the appetite is, so we could take it from there. So maybe if you are executives, you can sort of raise your hand a little bit. Okay. Product managers, raise your hands, please. Okay. AI engineers, data scientists, raise your hands. Okay, so I presume for those who didn't raise your hand, you're like none of the above. You just come here to chill, to have a beer like me, right? All right, great, terrific. So to start it off, I think over the years, I noticed the banks are starting using voice as a form of security and also instructions. It was kind of interesting to me that when they started doing this, I just don't know how it works behind the scene. Maybe if you can Chris, kick it off for us. In layman's term, how does it work behind the scene? I mean, who are we talking to? How does that work? I mean, are we talking to ghosts? How does that work?
Do you mean as far as the conversational agent? Or
conversational agent. How does it work behind the scenes?
So, I mean, there's a couple key components. First of which is really the natural language understanding processing part, right? How are you identifying an intent? How are you pulling out entities? Even understanding kind of sentiment, things like that. In our case, though, I think there's kind of a couple different ways that platforms will deal with this. Sometimes it's jumping from intent to intent through, like if you look at something like AWS Lex or Google Dialogflow. What I think is really valuable, though, is that once you do identify an intent, especially in the financial world, you do want to follow a standard operating procedure of some type. And so there's a couple different groups, including IPsoft, that then focus on how do you move through a flow that is also aware of the conversation. And then finally, how are you integrating with the rest of the services that are there, right? So how are you pulling information from different systems? How are you taking action in that environment, even with legacy systems in some ways? And so this is where RPA may be valuable because, there's still a lot of, mainframes. There's still a lot of Win32 apps that people have to click around, where humans are the automation today. And then finally, the idea of observational learning, it comes down to not only how are you retraining models like the NLU and NLP models, but how are you now allowing for subject matter experts to take action through either administrative tools or by way of having engineers or conversational designers then help them update the system in some way.
So in between bots and human being, what do you think the split in terms of interaction? Is it like 50-50, 7-30? What do you think?
Well, so I think the thing that's interesting is it depends on the actual case, right? So in our world, we try to get to the range of 80 to 90% handle rate for a particular
80 bots.
80% or 90% of the actual incoming inbound inquiry. So now. The types of things that do get escalated to human beings, though, right now there's very low trust in conversational agents. So a lot of trust still needs to be built. A lot of people are still, in some cases, yelling operator or purposely messing with the bots or conversational agents to be escalated in some way. But yeah, so I'd say we're talking about, in one of our largest customers, we're doing about 4.5 million calls a month for them via voice. And so that is a very large number of things. Of those, I think we're in the mid-80s when it comes to intent recognition, and somewhere in the mid to high 80s when it comes to skill completion. So that actually took their wait time from 50 minutes, like 50 minutes, to 5 minutes for a human being. And that's what you actually want, right? You want the human being to be able to pick up the phone on the first ring rather than handling all the simple things that could just be taken care of.
Jody, I think you share this with me, in terms of, when you have an actual user experience, when they compare to their onboarding, what's your initial expectations, or what do you see?
So when onboarding, you mean the bots themselves?
Yes.
To begin, when they first get launched? So, the very first thing you want to know is, like we were talking before, right? What problem are you solving? So you start really the process to first understand what are the top 10 things that a user is going to ask the bot, right? So that's the very first thing. So bots are like toddlers. You first teach them the first 10 things. You put them out there. you know they're going to have some rate of intent recognition and some not. And it's important in that experience to make sure that the user understands that the bot's still learning, right? Because it only gets better over time. So you will see, the engagement rates will go, they'll drop off initially, but then as the user, those who stick to it, will start to see an improvement over time. So I always say, always be very careful about how you're pitching the bot. It's not trying to, solve all the problems of the user, but the onboarding piece is important. So it's almost having the bot introduce itself and saying, here's what I can do, here's what I can't do, but I'm getting better every day, right? Not to overstretch and oversell.
How about you, Eric? When we talked about maybe, in terms of the experience, the patterns to drive adoption, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think exactly.
Engagement, adoption?
Yeah, and what Jody was just speaking of, also with bots introducing themselves, to just talk about bot personality for a second, what bot personalities sound like. And so one of the audio branding categories I didn't really bring up yet is voice branding. And so what does the voice of the brand sound like, whether it's a bot or a pre-recorded message? What is the user hearing when they're engaging with it? And is it addressing them by name, which is shown to significantly improve engagement? And so when you think about the different bots out there, like Capital One has Eno, which is intentionally a genderless name, and there's no preconceived notion. However, Bank of America has Erica, and some people might perhaps expect that to have a similar voice to Alexa, or maybe there will also be an Eric, like me, speaking to you as well for a variation on the chatbot. So I think that onboarding is a big point, and to help with personalization, I'll quickly cite something that Visa has actually done, where part of signing into these experiences, you might have a personal question or a sort of key visual icon or some sort of key, which in this case might be auditory, right? So when you sign up for your online banking and you might put in, okay, here's my totem, my visual icon here, I chose a violin. That was a true story. And so you might do that via sound now. You might pick your auditory icon sound for the experience to help know it's you during authentication. Beyond that, something that Visa found was one of the questions was piece of music. And so people would put in their favorite piece of music as one of the authenticating factors. Now, when they signed up, that song would actually start to play for 2 seconds, and people absolutely loved it. So you find things like personalization are huge, and when people join these, to really help them know that, yes, I've successfully kind of logged in, but also they know it's me, they know who I am.
Yeah, there's something interesting about the auth case of this and verification, right? So a lot of the time we'll do things where two-factor or even some type of secret, right? And then definitely if your account's been messed with, it's going to have a different sound or something like that. One of the things that we haven't done a lot of yet, but I think will be coming over the next couple of years, is this idea of voice fingerprinting. And so there's a few different groups that offer that service today, but it hasn't been something we've been getting requested by financial institutions, but it almost seems crazy to me that they're not doing anything like this, because, the idea of just inputting things via voice, there's a lot of, there was just a case about 2 to 3 weeks ago where a manager, their voice was spoofed using something like Lyrebird, and then they ordered a bunch of, they basically had a PO approved. And so I think we're going to see more and more of these cases come out over the next couple years. So I think that's something that definitely, when we talk about that aspect of it, there needs to be more verification. I think multi-factor is another alternative, but it's still, how many people here have a multi-factor key for their bank? Okay. That's not that many, actually. For example, like Hong Kong, HSBC requires everybody to have them. Internationally, there's a lot more of that type of use, and so anyway, something we need to figure out from a voice.
No, Chris is right on. I do a lot of international banking. If you do a lot of Asian banking, they give you so many different advice. It's not even literally multi. It's not one, not two. It's you go through so much hoop. If you are a fraud. not impossible, but very difficult to really get your money from your bank. So I think from the security standpoint, it makes a lot of sense. I was thinking about this from the voice perspective, right? So, in security, when we put in passwords in the older days, you have security questions, where was your mom born, or who's your first girlfriend, who did you date, or something to that effect. Now it's like, they're like multi-factor, right? You talked about that. But with voice, how safe is that? I mean, everyone's voice is somewhat unique, but how safe it is? Is it true? Well, I think two parts of the question: how safe it is, and then maybe the second part is, whatever it is it really that safe?
Yeah, well, I mean, the vendors will all say that it's, really, really great. Now, the thing that they're trying to do, though, is make sure that you're not being spoofed. So that means a generated voice. So if anybody's seen the thispersondoesnotexist.com, human eyes can still detect that these things are wrong in some way. And so figuring out how you build machine learning algorithms that can then detect voices that are not quite right, that is going to be kind of the build a better mousetrap type of issue for the coming decades, right? But then also when you talk about two-factor, I think it's more of an how do consumers adapt to this new technology and this new world where they really don't care about security that much. They don't care about security until they get burned, right? Same thing with privacy. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't all do the best we can for that, but that's the problem, is that there's not outrage until there's a real problem most of the time.
I think, yeah, in terms of voice emulation, you can get scarily accurate, and you see things like Adobe's Voca behind the scenes, right, where you can effectively speak for people. It's like the audio version of a deepfake, right? One thing I can see somewhat forecasted to help with authentication, to help with privacy too, is this kind of booming market of hearables. So I'm wearing Bose frames right now. So this is one way where I would be able to hear whatever my skill is saying to me, and without people right nearby hearing it. So that helps with privacy. In terms of interpretation,
then you say your PIN out loud to everybody in the room.
Exactly.
That's what I worry about.
If I hear if you see something 4 digits, I'll write that down. And
yeah. So unless you have one, they actually make a microphone on, if you've ever seen it on Kickstarter, that covers your mouth. But disregarding that, I think people are speculating now that AirPods may also be using bone conduction technology, not only for generating sound like Google Glass did, but for also interpreting language. And so I think that could be part of another authentication.
Like Control Labs was just bought by Facebook or Oculus, right? And so that's really interesting.
Right, so you might get another level of safety by adding, vibrational patterns as well as pure auditory signals. And then on top of that, I've also seen patents or research on maybe a 6th form of biometric authentication, which is actually the inner ear canal. And in many ways, it's seen as safe or safer than facial ID. And also, your ears tend not to change too much from birth like they might with fingertips and face and everything. So I think those are some interesting ways in which our ears at least will kind of...
I don't mean to be adversarial about this too, but there's like the term in biometric like security is goats that are out there. So if you're trying to find all the sheep and the sheep are identified in a certain way, there's like some small percentage of people that they refer to as goats. So like there's some people that don't have a retinal pattern, right? There's some people that are not born with fingerprints. And so, I mean, the problem is we're moving towards what's referred to as a zero trust environment, right? And usually security is about ideally all 3 things, but something you are, something you know, and something you have. Because the something you are will definitely be violated at some point, like when it comes to copying and everything.
So Jody, I think, when we, think about personal financial information, it can be quite a touchy subject for a lot of people to talk about. On top of that, it's also have the security issue. How do you, in terms of working with the bots, how do you sort of solicit those information and people feel comfortable talking about it? Any thoughts on that?
I have a lot of thoughts about that. I was going to say, you played that video, right, with Alexa, the interaction. If I was a thief, I'd be standing outside your house, putting a little microphone device saying, if you're going to use it, you're going to be saying out loud your PIN. That's basically handing them the keys. So I worry about that all the time. So it's really about how you train the humans to say, well, don't share your PIN out loud, but voice travels, right? So But the finance is a very personal thing, and it's basically your savings, your all investments could be gone. I worry about that using my banking site online. My dad actually got hacked a couple of years ago. Somebody was emulating. He got an email. He clicked on it. It's a phishing email. He didn't realize. He's very careful. But when he went to the RBC site, it looked or the Bank of Montreal site, it looked exactly the same. So if that can be done, voice to me as an interface is so easily transferable. People can hear it. Do you really want to encourage that? I think the bone conduction might have some interesting applications over there. So I was actually having this conversation with my client at Citi. So if you think about traders or credit risk officers that use applications, I said, how safe is it for them to go ask, because they are heavily regulated, right? You're not supposed to be sharing private information. He said, we're thinking that people who use it will be responsible. So how do you make sure that people are responsible with information, right? So I think there's going to be a lot of debate on that. People barely got used to, the fingerprinting and entering their device. So I think the interface makes the difference. So as humans, we speak, right? We hear, we have all the auditory. I think there has to be some sanity in what makes sense and what doesn't. I think voice has its place. Like we talked about earlier, right? Not everything's a hammer looking for a nail. I think there will be a use case. I don't think it's finance or personal banking is my view.
I have one word: blockchain.
Sure, please.
And hear me out. No, I'm just kidding. But
another blockchain again.
No, but I mean, the thing that's difficult about this is it's not actually a conversational interface issue, right? The reason why credit cards work the way they do is because there are assurances that even if your credit card number is stolen, right, that you are not at risk for the charges that take place on it. So I don't know. I keep on going back to the fact that there needs to be still, kind of evolution and fundamental change in the financial industry when it comes to a lot of these things anyways, right? It's just that, unfortunately, I think, fortunately, unfortunately, a lot of the time, these types of emerging tech or interfaces or experiences, they end up being the reason why people adopt new, better ways of doing things. And so we're going to catch the brunt of like, oh, well, so how will this be secured? And it's like, well, how is the rest of your infrastructure secure? All right. And so I think that's the real issue about a lot of this stuff too.
So, just a friendly reminder, Alec is working hard working around. So in case if you have questions, please email Alec, and we do screen it out here. So once you send it to Alec, Alec will send it to me, and then we'll try to answer some of your questions a little bit toward the end. But please make sure that you feed them in. So Eric, I think a lot of people talk about the security side. You talk about the good experience. Can you talk about sonic branding a little bit so that, you show your little demo, I think people get a little flavor of what that is. Maybe you can just expand on it a little bit, please.
Sure, yeah. So I think to take a look at the places it can go, I'll speak to some of what we've done lately. This is not a finance sector, so I won't spend too long on it, but as all technology changes, so not only, going from mobile banking to, conversational banking, you see it everywhere where cars are losing their combustion engines and becoming quieter on the road. So I think as everything becomes more automated, quieter, less people speaking, that's where we're able to kind of not fill that space with noise, but take that opportunity to add branding and add more meaningful sound than was even there in the first place. Maybe, we were never really intended to hear the rumbling of engines after we heard the, hooves and horsepower and that whole evolution of sound and where we end up today. And so when you listen to cars driving like Tesla and other startups, you'll notice that these are areas where sonic branding is really more helpful than just putting sound somewhere. It's literally a mandate by NHTSA that any vehicle traveling less than 30 kilometers an hour, 19 miles an hour, require some sort of generative sound. So I hope that gives just a sense of, some of the areas where it's becoming more prevalent. And then you look at the home IoT sector is another place where safety is a huge consideration, right? So whether you're logging into a banking experience or whether your house is recognizing that you're home, again, many authentication factors come into play here. And with less touchpads and visual interfaces, sound is becoming such an important way to communicate with our technology, both in terms of ease of use for the user, but also accessibility. And what that makes me think of back to this financial sector is, there's two sides of this conversation, literally. There's the user and then there's the bot. We talked about the disadvantage of the user speaking. People might hear the PIN coming out, right? But there's still all those, I think, just helpful factors from the audio end, because even ATMs are equipped with, assistive listening and devices like that. So I think you can also look at this as splitting it into two mediums, where maybe you're logging in and you're using your fingerprint still to authenticate, but then you're listening to what the bank has to say. So if you divide that conversation into one side visual, one side audio, I think audio will still have its place depending on where these things go.
So Jody, I think, in your presentation, I think also behind the scene, you talked about how emotional intelligence, human psychology is very important to you. That's what really led you to do this. We have seen, in terms of, I think retail, automotive, it's starting to have a hand at that, in that area. Can you talk about how, in terms of AI, NLP, how is that going to incorporate in financial services and financial institutions?
So if you think about the users, it's all about the persona of the user, right? So if you think about B2C, which is us consumers, understanding the state of mind, right? If you do banking, people think generally, finance is cold numbers, right? But it's actually not. If you think about people's lives, right? How they're managing their money, they may be having a hard time making their payment, right? So really making sure that you are understanding that. Now, look, a bot's never going to replace a human. And I think you could argue, I think, Chris, what you were saying is if you call into a customer service at a bank, will they understand you? I have to say, I've had some really good experiences where people are human, right? They know if you're having a bad day or if you hadn't made your credit card payment, something's going on, you have a sick child or a parent that you have to take care of. You have to incorporate some. It cannot be so cold of an interaction. So, those are the ways I think finance can become a little bit more human. Although, you'll see ads everywhere saying, a bank that's more human. Tell me how you make that more human, right? What are you doing for me to make that more human? So I think it will take some time. So that's on the consumer side. What I'm finding on a B2B side is regulatory, right, where people's businesses are at stake, right? SEC fining a lot of the banks. I think they have to start treating traders, right, risk officers as humans. I watched literally how traders are. You had the gentleman from JP Morgan. If you think about it, it's attention tracking.
Is he human or is he a bot?
I don't know, but fascinating research. Do you understand the emotional intelligence of a trader, for example, right? So there's IQ and there's EQ, and there's got to be equal amounts for this to work. It's my view.
Sure. So I probably have a couple more before I go to the audience for questions. But once again, the audience to question is to email Alec, and I'll pick it up here. How about metrics? When you talk about how do we measure this? In the financial world, there's so many metrics to measure different things. Can you talk about, are there specific metrics behind the scenes that they use it to measure the success or effectiveness?
Well, yeah, for a lot of financial institutions, it tends to come down to kind of LTV and then retention a lot of the time, especially for...
LTV is lifetime value, right?
Yeah, lifetime value. And generally, it's because you want to start to upsell people or cross-sell people to multiple services. So how far this person or this customer is utilizing all the different services you offer. And that's why you see a lot of things whenever you log into online banking, you'll see offers for credit cards, for loans, financial planning, anything like that, right? And so, that's kind of, well, and that's what's most important, right? Is that there's actually two different things that are trying to happen here. So, in the case of finance as a customer, you're absolutely right. It's not the numbers that matter to me. It's about what I do with that information or what I do with that ability to pay for something, and that's the user outcome, right? the business impact is really how are you continuing to allow for growth when it comes to these different types of organizations. When it comes to how are you thinking about it, they usually think about it from the standpoint of a lot of different marketing channels, and conversation is not always one that is a starting point, but I think it will be more of a starting point when we talk about cross-sell. But it's the idea of how are you now increasing conversion from these different marketing points. So if you look at something like Facebook Messenger bots, they're basically, the reason why they exist is that there's this huge chasm between display advertising within the Facebook sites and then lead generation for certain types of businesses. And so conversational agents or bots, chat bots technically in this case, are really trying to help build like a bridge through that gap, right? And so how do you get it so that there's not this like drop off and you're just throwing money at Facebook display? So they're trying to link this entire chain of things that they're showing, marketing, advertising, to cross-sell, upsell, and then ideally increasing LTV in some way.
So LTV and CAC is very common in the startup world. We use it all the time and using as a metric. How, what is it? LTV to CAC it's like a holy grail to a certain extent to a lot of early stage companies. Do you see, you talked about LTV. Is CAC common also? Or that's not so common?
It hasn't been in the conversations I've been part of, but then again, I think there is a difference in where your data science teams come from in a lot of these groups. So some of them come from if it's product side, finance side, they think more about the idea of how much money are they making. Whereas I'm betting you that if you come from the idea of customer support, actually for other types of organizations, we do see the cost of goods more like the cost of handling inquiry, right? And how does that then add into the overall cost for servicing a customer in some way? And so a lot of the time when we talk about customer support or handling a certain number of these calls, it really is a cost-saving measure rather than the idea of amplification of capability in some way.
So I'm going to go to the audience questions. So far I have 2. If you have more, keep coming. If not, I'm going to try to wrap it up a couple more after this. So one of the audience questions was, can you discuss the adoption rate and process for voice recognition with financial institutions? Maybe Jody, you want to take a stab on that one? I think we talked a little bit about that earlier. Maybe you want to just expand on it a little bit?
So again, splitting it up between consumer versus B2B, right? B2C and B2E, I call it, because you're serving your internal clients, employees. I think there are specific use cases where they're working really well. Generally speaking, it's customer service, right, which is the most popular use case around from a outward facing, right, business to consumer. I think the adoption we've seen, right, everybody has it on their phones. There's Erica from Bank of America, right? I think those are doing fairly well. Especially the ones where they're giving you heads up that there is some activity into your account. So I think people are getting to rely on that. The business to enterprise internally, I think the jury's still out because you really have to have good use cases. So for example, HR, right? HR or IT, which is pretty common, either finance or any other industry. Those are I think, taking hold where people want to reset their passwords or they have commonly asked questions. And the more complex things go into talking to a human. The other side within the financial sector, there's a lot of experimentation going on. Is how do you allow the employees to do their jobs better? So I think there's, at least from the clients I've worked with, there's a lot of experiments, and I think those are where they're just building that out. Because I think most of them are facing to consumers because they're trying to see where you can lower cost and increase revenue. But like I said, I'm a big believer that if you take care of your employees, I think you will see a outward-facing impact as well.
Sure. So I got the cue saying that here I'm in between you and your lovely drinks and networking time, but just like any panel, it always goes well with a prediction question because nobody really knows until they get it right many years out. I have a simple one here. When do you see conversational fintech will be fully adopted in the US for day-to-day operations? So I got 4 answers. Pick one. A, it's 3 years. B, it's 5 years. C, it's 10 years. And D is 10 years and beyond. 3, 5, 10. D, it's behind the moons. Go ahead. Why don't you go?
I have so many questions about the prompt, basically, but I will say that I'm probably going to be right for some aspect of this with A, 3 years.
Wow. I'll go with 5 because, I'm behind the scenes on some of these now, and so I know things are rapidly moving, but on the other hand, some brands still don't even have an Alexa skill out yet, so I see it taking just a little time.
What's a little time? 3, 5?
5 years, I'm sorry,
Okay.
5.
Mhm.
Yeah, I would oscillate between the two, but I think I will land on 5 because there's a couple of factors that have to land, right, for people to get really comfortable. I think there, again, the use cases that are available right now, they're pretty apparent, you can see them, but in a big way, where people trust it to do their banking with, you know, a wholehearted way, I think we're still a while away. I would put 5 years.
Chris, you got ganged up here, so. There you have it. How about a round of applause
Okay,
for your
we'll write
audience?
this on Twitter and we'll come back.